Hello, welcome to Tennessee's at-home learning series for literacy. Today's lesson is for all of our 8th graders, although everyone is welcome to tune in. This lesson is the 5th in this week's series. My name is Mr. Ayers, and I'm an 8th grade teacher in Tennessee schools. I'm so excited to be your teacher for this lesson. Welcome to my virtual classroom. If you didn't see our previous lesson, you can find it at www.tn.gov/education. You can still tune in to today's lesson if you haven't seen any of our others. We have already learned about the English poet William Blake and his poetry, and we've also studied the American poet Emily Dickinson. Poetry has been a powerful mode of writing in American and British history, and our goal is to gain a deeper understanding of some of the most successful poets and how they impacted their respective societies. We'll begin today by learning about the English poet A.E. Housman and his poetry. Before we get started, to participate fully in our lesson today, you will need paper, a pencil, and a surface to write on. Okay, let's begin. Today, our goal is to read an informational text, A.E. Housman, 1859 to 1936, in order to understand important detail about his life that will assist us in understanding his poetry. We'll review the TP-CAST tool for understanding poetry that we used in previous lessons, and I will guide you in using that tool as we practice using one of his poems, To an Athlete Dying Young. We will begin with me reading the short informational text and breaking it down as we go along for a deeper understanding. At the end of the lesson, I will assign you some independent work so that you can complete after the video ends to dig a little deeper in the things we talk about today. Now, let's dig into the first text we'll be studying, which is a brief introduction to A.E. Housman's life and work. The title of the informational text is A.E. Housman, 1859 to 1936, which tells us he lived about 77 years of age. The author is not listed for this text, so we'll simply refer to him or her as the author. Let's read the text. Born and raised in England, Alfred Edward Housman was primarily an academic scholar and a professor, but he also published 2 works of poetry during his lifetime. During his college years, Housman established himself as a scholar of the classic texts of early Greek and Roman culture. After college, he went on to become a professor of Latin, first at University College London and later at Trinity College, Cambridge. So, based on what you've heard in that first paragraph, what are some inferences you can make about Housman and his work? Take a moment to write your answer on your paper. Thanks. So here is what I inferred from this paragraph. It says that Housman was primarily an academic scholar and a professor, which means he spent a lot of time studying and was likely very well informed in his writing. The paragraph also tells me that he deeply studied classic texts of early Greek and Roman culture, and he went on to become a professor of Latin. With that in mind, I would think Housman might draw from a lot of cultural sources to inform his poetry. Let's take a look at the second paragraph. In his academic career, Housman worked tirelessly to create accurate translations of the classic works he studied. His rigorous or extremely thorough work focused on uncovering the words as they were written. Housman took this work extremely seriously and criticized other scholars he viewed as lazy. What does this paragraph tell us about Housman and how it might help us understand his work better? Write your answer on your paper. Well, it seems clear Houseman had a really intense work ethic. He also seemed to be very particular about his translation work and making sure everything was translated very literally. We also learned he was critical of others whom he viewed as lazy. It is likely his work ethic that enabled him to produce so much poetry alongside his other studies. But I'm personally curious to see if his judgmental attitude carries over into his poetry. So let's continue reading about him. When Houseman published his first work of poetry, A Shropshire Lad, in 1896, he revealed another side of himself altogether, different from his strict views of academia or academic studies. He wrote most of the 63 poems in the collection after the death of a beloved friend. This likely explains why many of the poems focus on the short span of a person's youth and the concept of death. Wow, that's interesting. Let's take a moment to think about how this new information might help us understand his work better. Write your notes, write your response on your paper. So he might be judgmental, but he's also clearly sympathetic and is able to communicate his emotions in poetry. I wonder if this experience changed him in a way that made him less judgmental. Let's go on to the next paragraph. Although the collection did not receive much attention at first, it became more popular during World War I because many of the poems depicted brave soldiers. Last Poems, his second book of poems, on the other hand, quickly achieved success upon its publication in 1922. With this volume, Houseman addressed a greater diversity of subjects. It is widely considered superior to his first publication. So, what does that tell us about Houseman and any last little thing that we know about him? Take a second to write down some notes. So I think it's important to note here that he went on to write more work that showed a lot more diversity. So to me, that shows that he was really able to grow as a writer. This completes the informational article describing A. Houseman's life and work. Now that we have a solid understanding of his life and work, let's analyze one of his poems to see if it reflects what we know about him. The title of the poem we'll be studying today by Houseman is called To an Athlete Dying Young. We're only going to do an initial read of Houseman's poem right now, and then we'll take a deeper look at it shortly after. A helpful note to start, the speaker of this poem is addressing a young athlete who has recently died. The poem compares how the town once carried the athlete on its shoulders after he won a race with how they now carry him to his final resting place. All right, let's read the poem. To an athlete dying young. The time you won your town the race, we carried you through the marketplace. Man and boy stood cheering by, and home we brought you shoulder high. Today the road all runners come, shoulder high we bring you home, and set you at your threshold down, townsman of a stiller town. Smart lad to slip the times away from fields where glory does not stay, and early though the laurel placed on someone's head grows, its withers quickly than the rose. Eyes the shady night has shut cannot see the record cut, and the silence sounds no worse than cheers after earth has stopped the ears. Now you will not swell the rout of lads that wore their honors out, runners whom renown or fame outran, and the name died before the man. So set before its echoes fade the fleet foot on the seal of shade, and hold to the low lintel up the still defended challenge cup, and round that early laureled head will flock to gaze the strengthless dead, and find unwithered on its curls the garland briefer than a girl's. This is a really challenging poem. It contains lots of layers of meaning. Remember, poetry is communicating both directly and indirectly. It is a difficult genre of literature to analyze. So we have been using the tool, the TP Cast, to help us do that. Let's refresh our memory about that tool. So the TP Cast is title, paraphrase, connotation, attitude, shifts, title revisited, and theme. On your paper, if you would, create a fresh template for you to practice on. Just draw out the 7 sections and we'll label as we go through. You don't have to have it looking fancy or perfect. Just give yourself enough room to take some notes. Perfect. So now let's talk about each section. Each of these sections should be completed in sequential order. Label your first section title. You may want to make a note in this section. Your goal is to consider the title of the poem and to make a prediction about what the poem is about. Poets are very intentional or purposeful about how they label their poems. There are always very important clues to the poem's meaning in the title, which is why it is a great place to start. For what reasons might the author have chosen the title To an Athlete Dying Young? Take a moment to jot down your thoughts about the title of the poem. Great. So in my notes, I wrote down that the title To an Athlete Dying Young seems to indicate the poem is written to someone the speaker knows, someone who died too young. I'm almost sort of curious why he wrote a poem and not a letter in this type of situation. That seems more common, that people express their emotions in different ways. Now, let's look at the next section and work on paraphrasing the poem. Here, the goal is to write in your own words exactly what happens in the poem. You are trying to write down what the poem says literally on the surface. You're not digging into the layers of meaning. This is really just a simple paraphrase. I know it's a lengthier poem with challenging language, but do your best to capture the gist of what you understand. Take a few moments to paraphrase what you remember from the poem. Great. So in my notes, I have the following as a paraphrase. And remember that the author is writing this, the narrator is speaking this as if he's talking to this athlete who has passed away. Remember that time you won the race and everyone celebrated your victory by bringing you home shoulder high? Well, now today we're carrying you shoulder high to place you in your permanent home in the ground. You were smart in leaving early while you were still on top. Now, you won't see those who broke your record and you'll be remembered for what you accomplished. Can you see how I kept my paraphrase kind of casual and simple? I am simply trying to capture the literal ideas that I can find in the poem. The next section is connotation. Remember that connotation means an idea or feeling a word invokes in addition to its literal meaning. Here is where we start to dig a bit deeper. We're looking for meaning beyond the literal. Poets use a lot of tools to do this, including figurative language or non-literal language, imagery, sound devices, word choice. Some really common figurative language that you're probably familiar with would be simile, metaphor, personification, and symbolism. Did you notice any of those present in this poem when we read it? Look through the poem again and look for any of these elements and take notes on your paper. You're not trying to capture every single one of them, only the ones that you think are the most important to understand the meaning of the poem. I'll pause for about 1 minute to allow you to finish up some notes. Okay, so here are some things that I noticed. First, I noticed the use of metaphor in the line, "Today the road all runners come." The road here would be the same as the cemetery. It is a fate all of us will face. I also noticed the use of the metaphor in the phrase, "Eyes the shady night has shut cannot see the record cut." This helps the reader to visualize death as a dark night that shuts a person's eyes to the world before them. It basically says now that an athlete is dead, he won't have to endure seeing another athlete outperform him. Let's take a look at the next section, attitude. In this section, we are trying to figure out the speaker's attitude or tone in the poem. Is it humorous, sarcastic, sad, uplifting? Jot down on your paper some adjectives you think capture the speaker's tone in this poem. I wrote down in my notes somber, affirmed, and content, which means a feeling of being okay with the state of things. These words all capture elements of the author's attitude in the poem. The poem is obviously sad because it concerns the topic of an early death, but the speaker is also reflecting on the positive elements of the situation and realizes his friend left the world at a good time in his life. Let's look at the next section, shift. Most poems have a shift, though it may be subtle. It is the moment there is a realization or a change in something. Look for the keywords of like but, however, though, although. There could be punctuation changes such as commas, periods, ellipses, semicolons, and line breaks. Let's read through the text once again to see if you can identify any shift. The time you won your town the race, we chaired you through the marketplace. Man and boy stood cheering by, and home we brought you shoulder high. Today the road all runners come, shoulder high we bring you home, and set you at your threshold down, townsman of a stiller town. Smart lad to slip the times which from fields where glory does not stay, and early though the laurel placed on someone's head grows, it withers quicker than the rose. Eyes with the shady night has shut cannot see their record cut. And silence sounds no worse than cheers after earth has stopped the ears. Now you will not swell the rout of lads that wore their honors out. Runners whom renown or fame outran the name died before the man. So set before its echoes fade, the fleet foot on the sill of shade, and hold to the low lintel up the still defended challenge cup. And round that early laureled head with flock to gaze the strengthless dead, and find unwithered on its curls the garland briefer than a girl's. So as you heard this text, did you hear a shift? Write down on your paper some ideas that you might have. Great. So in my read, the shift happens early in the second stanza, where the speaker says, today the road all runners come, shoulder high we bring you home, and set you at your threshold down, townsman of a stiller town. This is where we realize we are no longer celebrating the victory, and instead we are carrying him to his grave. This sets the stage for the rest of the poem, where the speaker reflects on the good side of the bad situation. So let's look at the next section, the title. Here we're revisiting the title. We look again at the title to see if it can take on a new meaning after we dug a little deeper into the poem. Take a moment to write down on your paper any changes from your initial thought regarding the title. Thanks. So after a deeper analysis, I think the title to An Athlete Dying Young really emphasizes the fact that the speaker is trying to send a message to others beside the young man. So we've reached the final section of the theme. Here we try to bring everything together and try to think about what does it say about humanity, about the world that we live in. So here I wrote down that I believe this poem is really emphasizing that life is short and we should embrace all the positive things while we're here because we don't know how long we're going to be here. What do you think the theme might be? Take about 30 seconds to write down what you think. Maybe it's similar to mine. Maybe it's not. All right, so I hope you found the TPCast tool to be useful in understanding the poem's meaning. Keep in mind that that's all it's intended for, a tool to help you understand and analyze the poem. So let's reflect on today's lesson. Today we learned about A. Housman's life and work and used a handy tool to analyze one of his poems. For your independent work, please respond in writing to the following prompts. Take a minute to write down the questions so you can answer them later. Great. So for your independent practice, just go through and try to answer some of those questions, jot some things down, see what you can come up with. Awesome. I have really enjoyed working this week with you, and especially today, working on analyzing A. Housman and his poetry. Thank you for inviting me into your home. I look forward to seeing you in next week's lessons and Tennessee's At Home Learning Series. Thank you. Goodbye.